Hey, this is Eternal King here, bringing you another LOR video today. So I really wanted to break down what it is about the Eternal format specifically that is superior to Standard, and perhaps in light of the most recent Riot news with the massive layoffs and the failure of the two-format PvP business model for the LOR devs, that maybe we can go back and talk about why the legacy format is superior, which again I don't need much incentive to do, but also is perhaps a way forward for the game moving forward for the competitive scene. So one of the things that makes Eternal a superior format is card viability. Given the fact that Eternal is so incredibly diverse in terms of the deck um, architectures and archetypes and card variety, it means that there is a larger number of cards that are viable. So I'll give you an example. I like talking about Grappler reaching top 100 rank in Masters with Braum. So Braum is a card that does not exist in Standard. It does exist in Eternal, and he was able to pilot a Braum deck to essentially the top of the competitive scene, um, which again would only even if Braum was available in Standard, he wouldn't be good. But given the fact that he exists in Eternal, and you can build a viable shell around him, he is actually a decent card in Eternal. Um, the other thing is general anti-aggro tools. This is kind of the big sticking point that makes the game different, and it is a lot of the old school stuff. So, Tavern Keeper, really good tech card into aggro and Felyord. If you find that you're getting absolutely destroyed by aggro nonstop, just throw in 3 Tavern Keepers into your deck, and I promise aggro will no longer be as much of an issue. The other, of course, a very important card is Blighted Ravine. So Blighted Ravine, being an anti-aggro tool, is very important. So when you look at stuff like the three-way split between between Elder Dragon, Galio, and Morgana, how that deck is 100% aggro, 100% tempo, and 100% board state, you think like, well, what happens if you just had like Tavern Keepers in Standard? All of a sudden that deck would be so much easier to deal with, right? Like, you're just playing the 3/3 body and healing for 3 and then jamming Blighted Ravine on 4 to, like, even if it doesn't kill anything and it's just damaging all the formidable stuff so they do less damage, like, that's so good. It is so good. And, like, it doesn't stop there. You have Trundle on 5, which again is going to block very well into a lot of the things, a lot of the board pressure that they have going for them. So that's just one region, right? You got Braum, you got Tavern Keeper, you got Blighted Ravine, and you got Trundle. That's one region. Tons of anti-aggro tools that are not available in Standard and are actually viable tech cards in the right play climate. Let's talk about Shadow Isles. Shadow Isles it's a very similar thing. Um, you have things like Go Hard, you have things like Vile Feast. Now, one of the key things about being a good Eternal player is understanding how many pings you need versus other types of removal. So yeah, Vile Feast is a good card, but there are times when you want to be on the Soul Harvest, when you want to be on the Hate Spike. It's important to understand the use of these cards, and just because they're good, it doesn't mean that they're useful in every situation. But again, having that anti-aggro tool that is Vile Feast, there are times when this card is game-winning. And again, you can Vile Feast and then Death's Grasp the Spider if you want, because again, most standard decks don't run pings or interaction of any kind other than strikes and stuff like that. So having to strike a spider would feel really bad if you put a Hate Spike on it. Like, it's not going to feel great for the opponent. And then the most important thing is that even cards that do exist in Standard become better in Eternal because you can play that longer game, right? Because you have the anti-aggro tools, you can play Ruination. I get Ruinated in Eternal all the time. And like, again, it's just one of those things where it's like, wow, someone's running that card and good for them. But they can do it because they have access to those excellent anti-aggro tools that you don't have access to in Standard. So yes, main deck Ruination as a one-of, go for it. Go nuts. It's going to see pretty high value. You want to run 2? You could probably run 2. I'll be honest. Pretty good. Vengeance is a better card, just like everything is a better card in Eternal. Because You have that card diversity. You can build interesting constructions. Vandal City, you talk about a lot of the mill strategies in Vandal City. You have access to Aloof Travelers, right? And Aloof Travelers is a much better card in Eternal because it's slower, because you have that time to play out turns, because open attack pressure isn't as much of a thing outside of dedicated aggro decks. You can play Aloof Travelers over and over again and get value off of that and have that be like the core of your deck and like have that be viable, right? You can play Kennen and bounce Kennen over and over again and have that be the core of your deck, and it will be viable. There inevitably will be stronger things, stronger cards and constructions than others, but the point is that everything is elevated due to the diversity of the play space. You can pilot Ramp successfully. You can pilot Mill successfully. You can pilot Braum successfully. You can do all of these things in Eternal. Vlad is another great example. Vladimir has seen quite a bit of success in the Eternal format after his changes, which is a good sign of a healthy game. Extra attacks off of Katarina or mixed with Braum with the Landmark. Either one is okay. They're both seen as pretty okay. Conservatory with Annie is better in Eternal because you have access to Flocked. And Flock is obviously an amazing card. Now, there's always going to be more degenerate style of control decks. For example, Nora Swain is very, very good in Eternal. Probably one of the best control decks in the game because it has both board presence and the cheapest removal available. And the combination of both it makes for a very successful deck. But again, that's good. You want there to be viable control decks in Eternal because control decks don't exist in Standard. You just have tempo and you have aggressive. We basically just have aggressive tempo. That's it. Those are the decks that are successful in Standard. They're not aggro decks. They're mid-rangey, aggressive tempo shells, and they all kind of build and play the same way, and they're all gigantic card piles. But again, in Eternal, nothing could be farther from the truth. Do you want to play Draven with Rumble? There is a viable Rumble shell in Eternal. And in fact, if you look at the stats, it's highly successful. And that is only, again, imagine running into Rumble on competitive ladder and having it be like this amazing game-winning card. You can do that in Eternal. Now, for the longest time, I would say that, competitive players, they would find that frustrating because it's like, well, I can't beat the meta if there is no meta. That's kind of the thing with Eternal, is that like as much as there is a meta, there is also not a meta because there is just so much card variety, which is great. But that can be frustrating from a player perspective because you're going to get blown out by noobs playing weird stuff. But again, if you're a good player, you shouldn't have to know their deck lists to have a decent matchup into them if you built your decks correctly. And you're not just memeing and teching and things like that. You should have a decent 50-50 chance into anything players bring, unless you just get really unlucky. And that happens, and you can just switch decks yourself. So that is the beautiful thing about Eternal, is like as much as there's a meta, there is not a meta. I think I've messed around with Dark and Ballista before, where you're trying to play, basically having the strikes be a round end effect and playing that a bunch of times. Like there's just a lot of cool things that you can do that I feel comfortable presenting and playing that I would never in my right mind feel viable in Standard. If I play Standard, I'm like, I want to play Scouts. Because like that's about as off meta as I can be in Standard. Is I can play a mid-rangey aggressive Demacia shell that isn't the meta mid-range aggressive Demacia shell. That's about as edgy as I can be in the Standard format. But in Eternal, you can do whatever you want. You want to play Mono Shurima? Play Mono Shurima. And it's actually really, really good. Xerath is a scary card when Sundisk is flipped. Like that's like your concede condition right there. Like what a good card. Nasus is a scary, scary card in Eternal. Thresh Nasus being one of the best decks. You can play Talia if you want to. Talia mid-range. Again, you could probably make Kai'Sa work if you were really dedicated to making Kai'Sa work. I'm not a Kai'Sa main, but I'm pretty sure you could make it work in Eternal if you get lucky with some of the matchups. Auction obviously is a complete terror in Eternal. So all of these things every single card you look at, Ziggs is better in Eternal. Like every single card that you look at in LOR is simply elevated by card diversity. Zoe Asol is a deck that exists in Eternal and is actually decent. It's very frustrating to play against, actually, I find, because you have the early elusive pressure with Zoe and the chance that she's going to flip, and then you just kind of delay the game with junk until you hit mana 10 naturally and don't even need to ramp, and it's actually surprisingly effective. So again, you know, Zoe Asol is a deck in Eternal. Aphelios is a deck in Eternal, which is, a, you know, again, very slow, very spell-oriented, very value-oriented. The games just last longer. And, you know, a lot of the time you'll have people who might be Masters level standard players, and they come into Eternal and they just don't get it. They don't get that you need highly synergistic decks and lists to be successful, because you do. So, you know, with the news that of the Riot layoffs, with the news that the two-model version of PvP isn't successful at all, is not working in the context of LOR's future, perhaps we just roll it back, right? Let's just double down on the OG Runeterra experience and just ignore all the pro players that were wrong. And that's my idea of the future of LOR. This is Eternal King, signing out.